The actions here today have stolen the life of a baby. I will probably picture him in my head for the rest of my life.
In a heart-wrenching sentencing, 4 people were held accountable for the tragic death of a 3-year-old boy just killed in a senseless act of gun violence. We are going to break down the sentencing as we take you inside the courtroom where this little boy's family shared their pain and their plea for justice while the defendants learned their fates. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. 4 people were sentenced Tuesday in connection with the tragic shooting death of a little 3-year-old boy, Luis Diaz. He was killed in Cleveland, Ohio, and when I say that this is a terrible tragedy, what I mean by that is this should have never, ever happened. The emotional sentencing took place before the Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court. Judge Shannon Gallagher handed down the sentences for each defendant involved in the September 2023 shooting death of this toddler. Now, this sequence of events unfolded on September 28, 2023, when prosecutors say that an argument broke out between one of the defendants, Catherine Treadway, and her neighbor, and this happened at a duplex in Cleveland. According to prosecutors, the argument escalated, prompted Treadway to then call her boyfriend, co-defendant, now 35-year-old Juan Davis, for help. And Treadway also moved her car out of the driveway, which is interesting. We'll talk about that in a minute. But according to investigators, this neighbor, who WKYC reports was Luis's stepdad, was standing outside a car where Luis Diaz's mom was sitting. She was in the front seat. Luis was in the back with his 11-month-old brother. And authorities say his mom had actually been a witness to a crime that allegedly was committed by Davis involving Treadway, so you can kind of see the apparent connections here. And in a press release from the state, prosecutors say that Treadway had told Davis that she wouldn't be showing up at court to testify against him in the domestic violence and aggravated burglary case. So that left Luis's mom as the only witness. Now, Davis, along with 30-year-old Devontae Parker and 18-year-old Jaden Sorensen, who was just 16 at the time, they arrive at this street near the duplex, and according to prosecutors, Parker, who is armed with a handgun, and Sorensen, wielding a rifle, ran toward the back of a nearby house, and without warning, they opened fire, shooting multiple rounds towards the victim's car across the street. And I think you can guess what happened. One of those bullets hit 3-year-old Luis, who was still strapped into his car seat. And when I say senseless, when I say tragedy, when I say this should not have happened, now you get what I'm saying about this. Now you understand it. Prosecutors say Davis, Parker, Sorensen, they sped off, left this little boy critically injured. Treadway told the media she tried to do CPR on little Luis, but he was rushed to the hospital and later died from his injuries. Now, his mom, brother, they were not hurt, but the stepdad was shot in the foot. Luis was hit in the back while he was still strapped to that car seat. According to a GoFundMe page, Luis was just ready to head out for a day to visit his grandpa when this shooting happened and he was killed. In a statement, the county prosecutor, Michael C. O'Malley, said 3-year-old Luis Diaz died because these 4 defendants are simply idiots. The issues between Catherine Treadway and Juan Davis led those 4 to shoot up a car and kill a child. Simply outrageous. There is a lot that we got to break down with this, and for that, I want to bring on a special guest. We're joined right now by Ohio prosecutor and former Deputy Attorney General Mark Weaver. Thank you so much for coming on, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Yes, Jesse, a very sad case, and as your viewers have become accustomed, that was an outstanding summary of a very complex and convoluted set of facts.
Talk to me. I mean, you've probably dealt with the worst of the worst. What are your thoughts on this kind of case? You know, we talk about the killings of children all the time, parents, step-parents, accidents. But this is a different level of senselessness. I mean, the judge used the word idiots for a reason here.
Yeah, this hit me particularly hard as a father and now as a grandfather. Every time I see a child victim, you can't help but putting your loved one in their place. I've worked on death penalty cases, numerous child rape cases, all sorts of heinous crimes. But this one was particularly evil, not just because of the victim. It's such a tragic little Luis dying from this, but for what was happening. This was essentially almost a recklessly called out hit on a witness in another case. And these 4 defendants are going away for a long time. 3 of whom went to trial, one of whom, the woman in this case, actually pled guilty. They all deserve a long time in prison for what they did in this tragic case.
We are going to go through what the sentences were for each of them, what the charges were. Got to say something, by the way, is this story and most of the stories on Sidebar show, the world can be something, to say the least, and it's scary thinking about how to protect yourself. And we always try to partner with companies that can maybe offer you some level of protection. I'll tell you what, now we have our sponsor, Delete Me. So did you know that your personal data is being harvested and sold online by data brokers? Yeah, anyone can buy your personal information. When that happens, you're at risk for a whole host of things: identity theft, phishing scams, potential stalking. But Delete Me helps keep your personal information private. I mean, they found dozens of data brokers with my information. They had to remove it from multiple listings. And by the way, Delete Me will keep monitoring those sites for you so your information doesn't find its way back on there after the first removal. And using Delete Me has also given me peace of mind about my family too, because if someone buys your data via a data broker, they can see information about your relatives too. So right now you can get 20% off Delete Me and protect your personal data when you go to joindeleteme.com/sidebar and use promo code sidebar at checkout. Is this a complicated case though, when you have multiple defendants, different roles, a shooting like this? I mean, talk to me about any complications there might be, and also what is some of the strongest evidence in a case like this?
Yeah, I know Prosecutor O'Malley. So he did a wonderful job charging this. He gave several different options for the jury, and in this case, the judge, to be able to bring accountability for little Luis, who was killed, and then the man who was shot in the foot. By bringing multiple different levels of charges, we call the lower charges lesser included offenses. Sometimes jury won't find the right state of mind to be able to prove aggravated murder or murder. They might prefer involuntary manslaughter or felonious assault in the example of the being shot in the foot. Prosecutor O'Malley not only brought all those charges that I just mentioned, but also brought, Ohio law has a gun spec, a 3-year gun spec. When you commit a felony with a weapon, that is 3 years. It always gets tacked on top of whatever the penalty is. So by giving the jury, in the case of the 3 defendants who went to trial, and the judge who sentenced all 4 of the defendants, these different options, that's why we saw such tough sentences as a result.
Let's talk about that, because after what was a lengthy and emotional trial, Judge Gallagher sentenced the 4 defendants involved, and the sentencing was split into 2 hearings. So there was one for Juan Davis and Devontae Parker, and the other one was for Catherine Treadway and Jaden Sorensen. So let's talk about 35-year-old Juan Davis. He was a pivotal figure in the death of this young boy. Prosecutors say Davis was the one who drove the group to the scene, helped instigate this violent altercation, and after having been in contact with Treadway because of this argument, right? So during an interview with detectives after the shooting, Davis told them that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He said he drove 2 people. He claimed he didn't know who they were, drove them to the scene, didn't know what they were going to do. He told investigators he didn't see guns in their possession, which would be, unlikely considering Sorensen was reportedly armed with an AR-15. And get this, at the time of that shooting, Davis had a no-contact order with Treadway, who was apparently pregnant with his 17th child. 17th child, that's according to police. He was also wearing an ankle monitor from a prior offense, and in the end, he was found guilty of multiple charges. 2 counts of murder, 6 counts of felonious assault, 3 counts of attempted murder, 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter, discharge of a firearm on or near prohibited premises, having weapons while under disability, meaning he wasn't allowed to have a gun because of a prior offense. Now, Davis was sentenced to life in prison, but there will be the possibility of parole after 49 years. 30-year-old Devontae Parker was sentenced to the same life sentence, also with the possibility of parole after 49 years, after a jury found him guilty on those same charges. Prosecutors say Parker's role was just as significant. He was armed with a handgun. He joined Sorensen in running toward the house and opening fire. He was actually captured by U.S. Marshals after the shooting. Turns out he was wanted in connection with not only Luis's death, but also the death of a man a few months earlier. Now, Judge Gallagher's words when sentencing these 2 men, very powerful, highlighting the profound impact of their actions, especially on the victim's family. And she noted that Luis's life had been stolen forever and that his future was cut short in an instant.
The actions here today have stolen the life of a baby. And it will never leave my mind that little boy, I will probably picture him in my head for the rest of my life, because his life was stolen from him. He's never going to grow up.
All right, Mark, I want to talk to you about this. So Juan Davis, Devontae Parker, both pivotal figures in this case. Talk to me first about the sentence, because Davis would potentially get out when he's 84, Parker not till he's 79. Is that justice? I mean, look, there's a chance whether or not they will actually get out at that time and whether or not they would live long enough to see the possibility of parole, but why not just straight up life in prison, no possibility of parole?
I thought the judge was pretty tough on these defendants. We see judges giving much shorter sentences for murder sometimes, depending on where in the state it happens. By the way, I can't help but stop and just remark upon that one fact that you mentioned, which I had to double check because I didn't believe it. That in fact, Juan Davis admitted this. He had 17 different children. Yeah. I've not seen that before. I've been a prosecutor since 2001, all around the state of Ohio. Death penalty case, child sex case. I've never seen that. That's remarkable. That's not a crime. That's just remarkable. I just really had to double check that. This is not a good person. Juan Davis was essentially the one who caused the crime to occur. Unless Catherine Treadway actually said to him, come here and start shooting up, he's the one who went and got two other people, one of whom was 16, start shooting semi-automatic weapon fire at this car of children and adults, shooting one of the adults and killing one of the children. So the judge certainly could have given a longer sentence, but judges have to presume that their sentences are going to be taken up on appeal, certainly those that came from a conviction at a trial. There's going to be a long appeal process. Judges often weigh whether or not an appeals court will overturn their sentence if they didn't make the right sentencing findings. And that's why sometimes judges will not give the maximum sentence.
But you agree those were the correct charges, at least for Davis and Parker, right?
Oh, yes. This was well charged. And a defense lawyer would say it was overcharged. I'm a prosecutor. I wouldn't say it was overcharged. Some of these charges merged. And as a result of the merger, you can only be sentenced on some of them. But I thought that Prosecutor O'Malley did a very good job sentencing charging this case.
Let me ask you this. So according to the court records, there was a jury who found Davis and Parker guilty of most of the charges. But it's our understanding when we're reading the court record, when it comes to Davis's case, the court actually found him guilty on an involuntary manslaughter charge, as well as having weapons while under disability. Parker is also shown as having been found guilty by the court, not the jury, on that weapons under disability charge. That was surprising me. Why do you have that? Would the jury decide some charges, the court decides the others?
Yeah, I looked at the court records as well, and I was a little confused myself. Not my case. I'm reading the same stuff you
Sure.
did. In Ohio, like most states, defendants can opt for a bench trial rather than a jury trial. That could have happened here. My reading of it was only one of these four defendants actually took responsibility ahead of going to a trial, and that was Catherine Treadway in this case, who did evince some small level of remorse that was somewhat credible when she was sentenced.
Talk about her. Yeah.
The other ones didn't strike me as being remorseful. One, I think it was Juan Davis, said he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. When you show up at 7 p.m. at the Italian restaurant when you were supposed to be at 8 p.m. at the Greek restaurant, that's showing up at the wrong place at the wrong time. This was getting other people to commit heinous violence against innocent people, and you were the one who drove them there and largely spurred them up to do that. That is not being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Is it an advantage for the prosecutors to charge them all and try them all at the same time in one trial? Is that an advantage for the prosecutors? It
typically helps with the economy of the proceedings. Nearly every prosecution office is strained for resources, and going through back-to-back multiple trials on the same set of facts is hard on the witnesses you have to call and your assistant prosecutors. I think for everybody it makes sense. There's always, of course, some concern that one of the defendants' rights will be affected by trying these defendants at the same time. So a prosecutor who wants to preserve those convictions on appeal has to be very careful about whether or not insisting that they all be tried together.
Mark, I want to ask you about the judge here. So Judge Gallagher's comments during the sentencing, they emphasized just the impact on this family, this victim's family. How does a judge's statement during sentencing reflect, the emotional weight of the case, the harm done to the victim's family? How important is it for the judge to make that statement?
Under Ohio law, judges are required to make certain statutory findings that the sentence being offered aligns with the purposes and principles of felony sentencing. So every time I have a sentencing hearing as a prosecutor, I expect the judge to tick off those statutory requirements. That's got to be in the record. What is not required by the law is extemporaneously speaking about the impact of this case. I'm so glad that Judge Gallagher did that in this case, because remember, there are victims in that courtroom whose lives will never be the same. In fact, the father of little Luis testified holding a series of photos in a large frame, and how his life has never been the same. And all of us can imagine that's exactly true. His life will never be the same. And so when a judge does that, it's not required by law, but it reminds us that judges are there to follow the law and to do justice. And part of doing justice means showing some compassion for the plight of these victims.
And let's move on to the next one. So we have 31-year-old, and we're going to play some of those statements too, and they're quite something to hear. I want to move on to 31-year-old Catherine Treadway. She too played a different but important role in what happened, and even though she didn't pull the trigger, prosecutors say that she contributed to Luis's death nonetheless. She's the cause, because after the argument with her neighbor that afternoon, authorities say she was the one who called Davis and set all of this in motion. Now, Treadway entered a guilty plea, and in return, prosecutors dropped some of the charges, including a murder charge. So she pled guilty to 1 count of involuntary manslaughter, 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of felonious assault having weapons while under disability, and she was sentenced to 20 to 25 years in prison. Now, Mark, why would prosecutors do that? Why would they drop those charges and her ultimately pleading guilty if, again, she was the catalyst for why all this happened?
Certainly seems like she lit the fuse for this explosion of violence that was going to happen. But for her actions, these things wouldn't have occurred. Now, as a prosecutor, every time I have multiple defendants, I have an obligation to prove every one of them to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And juries are funny. Unless I get all of them unanimously on my side, I could lose the case by acquittal or I could get a hung jury. So whenever I can get one defendant to turn state's evidence towards the others, it gives me an advantage that I didn't have otherwise. Now, in a perfect world, I wouldn't have to do that. But in a perfect world, the victims may never see justice if there was an acquittal or a hung jury. So I can understand why Prosecutor O'Malley would have arranged this outcome. She's still going to be in prison for quite a long time. If she had a weapon under disability, I didn't see this in the news articles. I presume she's previously a felon. That's typically what weapons under disability means under Ohio law. Either you're impaired, you're drunk, or you have some felony history, which means you're not eligible to be in and around guns.
Interesting. Talk about her sentencing. So you mentioned this before. Prior to her being officially sentenced, she offered an apology to Luis's family, expressing arguably deep remorse for her role in what happened to this young boy. Take a listen.
I would like to apologize to you and say I apologize for the role that I played. And Your Honor, I would like to say to the court, I take full responsibility for the role that I played, and whatever time you give me, I'm going to go down there and make the best of my time.
Now, although the judge recognized that Treadway appears to have this lack of prior criminal history, she also made it clear that without Treadway's involvement, Luis would still be alive.
I will never understand the coldness, the ice in your veins that was needed to put that baby in the car seat, to move your own car out of harm's way. But without your actions, Luis would be alive.
So, Mark, again, powerful words there from the judge. Did you think the manslaughter charge was appropriate?
Well, there has to be some reduction in order to get a defendant to plead guilty, typically. I've seen a lot of defendants express some level of remorse. I wouldn't say this was the greatest amount of remorse, but it was some genuine remorse. When someone says, I'm ready to give whatever sentence you give me, that's either someone who's a little bit contrite or has been well coached by their lawyer, or both, because judges don't typically hear that. They don't typically hear someone say, whatever you give me, I'm going to serve. That, to me, is some level of contrition. Having said that, do I think this woman has had some great turnaround and seeing the truth and the light? It doesn't seem that way. It seems like she did this as a part of a way to get a shorter prison sentence. But the other ones who insisted on the trial, and one of whom, Juan Davis, said he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is such an understatement, strikes me as they're not repentant at all.
Let me ask you about this. So prosecutors said that Treadway had called Davis, and after she called him, she moved her car out of the driveway of the duplex. There's been speculation that she knew there could be gunfire, that she didn't want her car to get damaged. And in fact, during closing arguments, the prosecutor apparently told the jury, if she's so innocent, how on earth is her car way the hell down here before shots are ever fired at her driveway? I thought that was a curious point.
Yeah, she has this dispute, which is probably related to this previous connection between them and this willingness to be a witness against her boyfriend. She is calling for violence to be brought. Why else do you call this man other than to vanquish some witness who might be testifying against him later? So she calls Juan Davis not to be a moral support in some verbal argument. She's calling him to bring violence, and he brings a 16-year-old and a 29-year-old to the fight with semi-automatic weapons, one a pistol, one an AR, AK-style weapon, and now we have a dead toddler and we have a man injured.
Let's talk about 18-year-old Jaden Sorensen, who, as you mentioned, he was 16 when this happened. He was the youngest defendant involved. His actions, though, just as significant, because at the time of the shooting, even though he was 16 years old, he was charged as an adult. He entered a guilty plea in January to a lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter, 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of felonious assault, 1 count of improperly handling firearms in a motor vehicle. He testified against his alleged co-conspirators in their trials and said he never actually fired any shots because his gun malfunctioned. Now, attorneys for Davis and Parker, they attacked Sorensen's credibility as part of their defenses, saying that Sorensen was lying. Mark, your thoughts on this?
Boy, a 16-year-old with a semi-automatic rifle trying to shoot to kill somebody has all the intent for these crimes, whether or not the gun misfires, certainly in the attempt charges, right? And the improper handling of the firearm, which is the least of his problems. Yes, he testified and he tried to help himself, but every one of these people was a criminal actor. Is it more heartbreaking that it was a 16-year-old whose brain isn't fully formed yet, and you expect the older people, the 29-year-old and Juan Davis, who was, I think, 34 or 33 at the time, do you expect them to be the adults? Yes, you do. He was charged as an adult. He was sentenced as an adult. He's going to do time now as an adult.
Let's talk about his sentencing, because before he was sentenced, he expressed, or seemingly expressed, remorse for his actions, acknowledging his guilt. He spoke about becoming a father while in custody, a life-changing experience that led him to reflect deeply on his mistakes. I mean, again, his mistakes of killing a young boy.
So I pray asking God, my victims, for forgiveness. I prayed asking God for knowledge, wisdom, and a deeper understanding of life. I feel like he answered my prayers shortly after, incarcerated, I found out that I had a baby girl. Now I see everything more clearly in a different light. The thought of somebody hurting my baby girl will crush my world, so I feel for the family.
Now, Judge Gallagher expressed hope that Sorensen could change, but cautioned him that the road to redemption would be difficult. And Sorensen was sentenced to 11 to 15 years in prison. Mark, what do you make of that sentence?
Yeah, Sorensen says he has a young daughter, and that brought about a change of heart. That is possible, and all of us who've had kids know that it does change your outlook. So I do not want to diminish the possibility that he could find some redemption, some repentance. Having said that, because of these actions, that daughter of his will now be in her 20s, I suppose, or almost in her 20s, perhaps having children of her own by the time he gets out. Here's hoping that every one of these criminals will come to a place where they can understand the damage they did. But the system of justice has got to mete out punishment. I was proud to see Judge Gallagher and the sentences she gave.
And before that sentencing was finalized, Luis's family, as you mentioned, had the opportunity to speak in court. His father was visibly devastated, held up, as you mentioned, pictures of his son, shared the deep emotional toll that this loss has had on this entire family.
It's hard to talk. I want to. All I can say is it's been very hard for me. All I can say is all of this has been hard and stressful. I haven't been myself since I lost my first child.
And the young boy's grandmother, fighting back tears, described her grandson as a hero.
Good morning, Mr. Rivera. What are you holding?
My hero.
I have other grandkids, but he was very special. took my heart, and I want justice for this.
Luis's grandfather also spoke through his very visible pain, expressing the deep emptiness left by his grandson's death.
I miss my grandson a lot. And I used to see this on the news. Never thought it was going to happen to me or my family. And it did. And now, when I see this type of cases on the news, I cry.
Obviously, these are victim impact statements. I think they're incredibly important to hear. What did you make of them, and what impact do they have on the actual sentencing?
Every time I'm in court and I hear victims speak, my throat gets dry because this is the real human impact of the crime. Up until then, it's been papers and witnesses. But when you hear that impact, that's when it gets real for me. Typically, judges will come out to the bench with a very good idea of what they want to do. In fact, the paperwork is so detailed that the judge will have often prepared it ahead of time. But sometimes the voice of a victim can so move a judge so as to change the punishment in the case. We won't know ever if that happened here, but if there was ever a set of victims who could speak from the heart about the loss of this child, it was this family.
It's important to hear. Look, the law did its part. It measured out some semblance of justice, but it's not going to bring this 3-year-old boy back. This family is not going to get this child back. It is a senseless act of violence. It is a tragedy. We wish this never happened. And just, if there was one decision, if one person just did something different that day, this wouldn't have happened. Mark, thanks so much for coming on. Great seeing you, and appreciate your insight and expertise as always.
Always good to be with you. Thank you, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.